3 years of isolation shattered by a single plea. Jake Reeves, a lone geologist surviving on a brutal alien world, faces a choice. Ignore the Azuran child's desperate cry or risk everything to save a stranger. His entire survival routine, traps, notes, solitude, collides with an ethical test that could redefine his purpose. Will human fear override compassion when the stakes are this high? Jake Reeves moved through the sun-scorched landscape as he did every morning, his boots kicking up fine red dust that settled on worn leather. The twin suns beat down with relentless heat, baking the cracked earth into a mosaic of desperation. He followed the same path he'd walked for 3 years, a circuit of survival etched into the barren terrain. Each step was measured, each breath conserved. Water was rationed by the ounce, shade calculated by the minute. He checked the first snare with practiced hands, fingers tracing the tension of the wire. His eyes scanned the ground for disturbances, reading the soil like pages in a familiar book. The traps were simple but effective, crude mechanisms designed to catch small burrowing creatures that provided meager sustenance. He adjusted one wire by 2 millimeters, his geologist's training making him precise even in this grim application. Every setting was documented in his field notes, a ledger of survival rather than discovery. His notebook contained maps of dangers, not mineral deposits. Pages were filled with sketches of predator territories, water source contamination levels, and seasonal storm patterns. He noted where the sandstalkers hunted at dusk and where the rockslides made travel impossible after rains. These observations were his only defenses against a world that seemed determined to erase him. The silence around him was both his most reliable ally and his heaviest burden. It meant no predators were nearby, but it also meant absolute solitude. He remembered the crash sometimes, the screaming metal, the fire in the sky, the final transmissions from crewmates who didn't make it. That memory was why he maintained the silence. Connection meant vulnerability. Loss had taught him that every relationship ended in pain, so he built walls instead of bridges. His isolation was a conscious choice, a shield against further heartbreak on a planet that already tested his limits daily. The landscape held its breath under the oppressive heat. Jake continued his rounds, checking the third snare, then the fourth. His canteen sloshed faintly with the morning's water ration. He was calculating the evaporation rate when the sound came. Not the wind through canyon walls, not the shift of warming rocks. A child's voice, clear and desperate, cut through 3 years of carefully maintained silence. "Please, human, assist. My mother is trapped." The words hung in the air, a challenge to every survival rule he'd created. The voice carried a strange resonance, like stones grinding underwater, yet the tremor of pure fear needed no translation. From behind a cluster of jagged black rocks, the Azuran boy emerged. His blue-tinged skin was dusty and pale with dehydration, the delicate membrane between his fingers dry and cracking. He moved with the unsteady gait of exhaustion, his large, dark eyes fixed on Jake. Every survival instinct told Jake to step back, to raise his weapon, to maintain the distance that had kept him alive. The boy was small, perhaps the size of a human 10-year-old, but his alien physiology was a question mark, a potential threat his protocols demanded he treat as absolute. The plea was a direct assault on the rules Jake had carved into his own soul. Rule 1, trust nothing. Rule 2, conserve everything. Rule 3, survive alone. To help meant exposing his position, expending precious resources, and following a stranger into unknown territory. His mind calculated the immediate costs. The water in his canteen represented half a day's ration. The time spent could mean missing the window to reset his traps. The path the boy would lead him down was uncharted, a blank space on his map marked only with the word peril. Every ounce of his training screamed at him to turn away, to let the planet's cruelty run its natural course. It was the logical choice, the survivor's choice, but the silence was now broken. He could walk away, but he would never again hear only the wind. That child's cry would live in the quiet, a permanent stain on his conscience. He saw the raw terror in the boy's eyes, a reflection of the same primal dread he'd felt watching his shipmates die. It was a humanity he'd buried deep, a connection he'd sworn to avoid. The harsh light of the twin suns felt accusatory, highlighting his inaction, his selfishness. He was a geologist, a man who studied the history of worlds, and in this moment he was failing the most basic test of his own. His hand went to the knife on his belt, fingers resting on the worn handle. It would be so easy to gesture the child away, to retreat into the safety of his solitude. He pictured his shelter, the meticulous notes, the fragile piece of his existence. Then he looked at the boy's trembling hands, the dust caked on his tunic, the absolute desperation in his alien face. The internal battle was silent but violent, a war between the man he had become and the man he used to be. The calculus of survival was suddenly insufficient, its equations failing to account for this new variable. His fingers uncurled from the knife. They moved instead to the strap of his canteen, the motion slow and deliberate as if fighting against a great pressure. The metal cap unscrewed with a faint click that seemed loud in the tense air. He did not yet offer it, merely held it, his own thirst suddenly a secondary concern to the one before him. The action was a breach of protocol, a crack in his shield, and the first step onto a path from which there would be no return. He handed the canteen to the boy. The Azuran child drank with a desperate gulping urgency, water spilling down his chin and darkening the dust on his tunic. Jake watched, his mind already tallying the loss. That was a quarter-liter gone. The calculation was automatic, a relentless inventory of cost. Time was another commodity dwindling fast. The optimal window for checking the eastern trap line was closing. Exposure was the highest price. Every minute spent in the open under the twin suns increased the risk of being spotted by patrols or predators. His survival was a ledger of these three currencies, and this act was spending them all at once. The boy gasped, breath returning, and began speaking in his rasping tongue, gesturing wildly toward the jagged highlands to the west. Jake's training allowed him to parse the description through a geological lens. The boy spoke of a soft place that shakes, of his mother sinking into the ground. This translated in Jake's mind to unstable substrate, likely a silt-filled basin or a pocket of quicksand. But the location was the problem. The boy pointed toward the serrated ridge, a region Jake had scouted only from a distance. His maps for that area contained a single, stark notation based on sensor ghosts and animal avoidance. Unconfirmed high-yield threat. Do not approach. It was a blank space filled with potential danger. Helping meant walking directly into that unknown. His own people's warnings about the Azurans surfaced from memory. Briefings that described them as territorial and deceptive, their pleas for help often a precursor to an ambush. The corporation's intelligence was clear. Trust equaled death. This could all be an elaborate trap, a predator using its young as the most effective bait. The logic of his situation was undeniable. To go was to risk everything, his water, his safety, his life, on the word of a frightened child from a species he'd been taught to fear. He looked from the treacherous horizon back to the boy. The child's large eyes were wide, still clouded with panic, but now also held a flicker of something else, a fragile, desperate hope directed entirely at him. The terror on his face was not a performance. It was too raw, too immediate. It was the same primal fear Jake had seen in the mirror after the crash. The corporate warnings were abstractions, theories formulated in the safety of an orbiting ship. The child's fear was the truth happening right now in the dust at his feet. The moral cost of refusal suddenly had tangible weight, heavier than any canteen or weapon. His internal calculation reached its final sum. The numbers were clear. The risk was astronomical. The logic of survival demanded he turn back. But the math was incomplete. It failed to account for the look in the boy's eyes, for the echo of his own lost humanity. The geologist's cold logic, honed over 3 years of isolation, was overruled by a deeper, older impulse. It was not a sudden rush of emotion, but a quiet, definitive shift in priority. Survival was no longer just about his own heartbeat. He nodded to the boy, a single sharp motion. He pointed west toward the ridge. The decision was made. His expertise would now be applied to a rescue, not just an escape. Jake's training had been for extraction. 3 years of planetary surveys were about identifying mineral seams and resource concentrations for corporate profit. Every tool, every technique was designed to take from the land. Now that same knowledge had to be applied to preservation. The purpose was inverted and the stakes were a life. His understanding of rock and soil, once a means of wealth, became his first and only tool for a rescue. He followed the Azuran boy, his eyes constantly scanning the ground. He was reading an alien geology with human eyes, matching the boy's descriptions to the terrain. The child's words about a soft place translated to a low basin ahead. Jake's training kicked in. analyzing from a distance. The vegetation at the basin's edge was stunted and pale, a sign of poor root anchorage. The color of the sediment was a uniform dull gray, lacking the stratified bands of stable earth. He saw the subtle layering of fine silt over a darker, unknown substrate. These were textbook indicators of hydrostatic instability, a place where solid ground was a temporary illusion. He shifted the pack on his shoulders. The weight was familiar, but its purpose had transformed. The rock hammer was no longer for taking samples, but for testing surface integrity. The core extractor, designed to pull mineral cylinders from bedrock, might now be used for leverage or support. His length of high-tensile cordage meant for securing gear could become a lifeline. Each item was reevaluated not for its corporate function, but for its potential to save the woman trapped ahead. Each step was a deliberate analysis. He tested the ground with his weight before committing, feeling for the slight give of sediment. He noted the composition under his boots, sandy gravel here, a firmer clay there. He guided the boy onto the more stable patches, his mind creating a real-time map of safe passage. The academic knowledge from textbooks and lectures was being applied in a brutal final exam where failure meant death. There was no room for error, no second attempt. The basin spread out before them, a vast, flat plain that seemed to shimmer in the heat. To the boy, it was simply the trembling field. To Jake, it was a death trap written in geological language. He stopped the child with a raised hand. His eyes narrowed, picking out details an untrained person would miss. The way the light bent slightly over the center of the field suggested a hazy emission of heat or gas from below. The absolute lack of any animal tracks crossing its surface was another glaring warning sign. There were no rocks, no plants, nothing that suggested a solid anchor point. It was a perfect, sterile trap. He crouched, picking up a fist-sized stone from the safe ground at the edge. He weighed it in his hand, then tossed it in a high arc toward the center of the field. The stone landed with a soft, almost silent thud. For a second, it rested on the surface. Then, with a slow, sinking inevitability, it was pulled downward. There was no splash, no dramatic collapse. It was simply swallowed, the gray dust flowing over it like a liquid until it vanished without a trace. The surface smoothed over again, perfectly calm, perfectly deceptive. His expertise had spotted the danger long before his feet could have made the fatal mistake of testing it. The real problem now began: how to cross it. The plain ahead looked solid, a dull gray expanse stretching to the horizon. It was a perfect lie written in dust and refracted light. Jake stood at the edge, his instincts screaming a warning the placid surface tried to hide. There were no rocks, no plants, no cracks, just an unbroken sheet of fine powder that seemed to absorb sound and light. It was too uniform, too still. Nature abhors such perfection. It always hides a trap. He watched the way the heat wave shimmered above it. The light didn't just waver. It bent in a faint, oily distortion directly over the center of the field. That wasn't just heat haze. It was a gas release, a seepage from something living and breathing beneath the false floor. He picked up another stone, larger this time. He tossed it underhand. It landed with a soft thump and began to sink immediately, the gray dust flowing over it like thick liquid. There was no struggle, no dramatic collapse. It was a silent, efficient consumption. The surface smoothed over in seconds, leaving no trace. The Azuran boy tugged at his sleeve, his voice a low, urgent rasp. He pointed at the vanishing stone, then at the ground beneath their feet. He used his hands to mimic something grabbing from below. His words, translated through broken gestures and fear, painted a clearer picture. The field was not Earth. It was a colonial organism. A massive membrane stretched over a digestive pit. It reacted to pressure, to weight. It sensed vibrations through the dust and reached up with unseen tendrils to pull anything heavy down into itself. It was a passive hunter, a patient stomach disguised as land. Their goal was a dark spike of rock rising from the center of the field, perhaps 300 meters away. It was a taunting island, the only solid point in a sea of death. The boy's mother was there, caught on that rock or just beyond it. The distance might as well have been 1,000 kilometers. Every survival tactic Jake knew was useless. Stealth meant nothing to a creature that felt your footfalls. Speed was impossible in the sucking dust. Strength would only make you sink faster. This was not a test of power, but of weight. He studied the island, then the deceptive ground, then the fading light. The conventional approach was suicide. Walking was negotiation, and the ground held all the power. It demanded a tribute of mass it would never return. To cross, he would have to break that contract entirely. He had to find a way to move without offering the weight it craved. The solution wasn't in his pack of tools, but in the principles they represented: leverage, distribution, buoyancy. He had to defy the very promise of gravity, to spread his mass so thin the hungry ground below would not recognize it as food. He looked from his cloak to a piece of desiccated wood near the shore, his mind assembling a new kind of tool from the fragments of the old. The crossing would be a slow, agonizing dance on a surface that waited to swallow them whole. A faint purple hue began to bleed into the western sky. Night was coming, and with it the hunters. Jake knew the tremor feeders would emerge from their dens, their sensitive underbellies reading the smallest vibrations in the ground. A slow, careful crossing might avoid the field's hunger, but it would make them a perfect target for the predators that ruled the dark. The need for speed now fought directly against the absolute need for caution. Every minute spent on this shore was a minute stolen from their survival. Jake moved fast. He dropped his pack to the ground, his hands working with a desperate urgency. He emptied its contents, a lifetime of careful rationing spilled onto the safe dirt. He kept only the canteen, the rock hammer, and the coil of cord. Everything else was dead weight, an anchor that would doom them. He saw the boy watching him, his large eyes wide with confusion and fear. There was no time to explain the new threat. The falling light was explanation enough. His eyes scanned the debris at the field's edge. A long, desiccated piece of wood bleached white by the suns lay half buried. It was not junk. It was potential buoyancy. He pulled it free, testing its length and strength. It was light, porous, and wider than his shoulders. He tore his heavy cloak from his back. It was not for warmth anymore. It was surface area. He laid it flat on the ground next to the wood. The solution was not in muscle, but in physics. He had to distribute their combined weight over an area so large, the field's membrane could not recognize it as a single point of pressure. It was a precise calculation of mass and surface tension. He lashed the wood to his boots using the cord, creating a crude pair of snowshoes for a desert of dust. He tied the corners of his cloak to the boy's smaller feet, fashioning a second wider set. The boy watched the entire process, his head tilted. He saw a human take common objects and reassemble them into a solution his own people had never conceived. This was not Azuran ingenuity, born of deep familiarity with the planet. This was human improvisation, a stubborn refusal to accept the rules of the environment. It was a strange, reckless kind of magic built from logic and need. Jake stood, the long plank strapped to his feet, feeling absurd and precarious. He handed the boy the two corners of the cloak not tied to his feet. "Hold these wide," he instructed with a gesture, mimicking spreading the cloth. The boy understood, gripping the fabric, making his own improvised sail. They were a ridiculous sight. A man and a child prepared to walk on water that was not water, on land that was not land. The makeshift floats were ready, a pair of rafts designed for a sea of dust. They stood at the very edge where solid ground gave way to illusion. The gray expanse stretched before them, silent and hungry. The purple in the sky was deepening to a bruised violet. The first step would be the test of theory against a deadly reality. There would be no trial run, no chance to adjust the design. Failure meant a quick, silent consumption. Jake took a final breath of safe air and shifted his weight forward. Jake lowered the makeshift float onto the trembling field. The wood touched the gray dust. This was the moment. His entire theory of weight distribution faced its test. The material could hold their mass spread thin, or it could sink instantly, pulling them down with it. There was no middle ground. Failure was absolute. He applied pressure slowly, leaning his weight onto the wood. His hands gripped the edges, reading the feedback through his palms and fingers. He felt for vibrations, for the slightest shift. The field resisted for a moment, the surface firm under the float. Then a low, organic sound of strain vibrated up through the wood. It was a deep groan, like a great beast stirring in its sleep. The sound was wrong. A clear sign the ground was not ground at all. It held, but the protest was a constant warning. He shifted more weight forward. The groan intensified, a hum of tension through the deceptive plane. He kept his movements fluid, a slow and continuous glide. He did not step. To lift a foot would concentrate his weight on a single point, a deadly mistake. He pushed the float forward an inch, then slid his other foot along behind it. It was an exhausting, deliberate shuffle. Progress was measured in centimeters, not meters. The Azuran boy watched his every move. He mirrored Jake's actions exactly, placing his own cloth-covered feet precisely where Jake's had been. He did not question the method or hesitate. His complete trust was a quiet testament, a bond forged in shared desperation. The boy understood the stakes. He moved with a focused intensity, his small body tense. They pushed further out, the safe shore receding behind them. The air grew still and heavy. The only sounds were their own labored breathing and the constant low groan of the strained field beneath them. The purplish hue of the surface seemed to deepen the farther they went, the light bending in that faint, oily distortion. The island of rock was still a daunting distance away, a dark spearhead in a sea of gray. Jake's arms ached from the constant pressure of guiding the float. His legs burned from the controlled gliding motion. Every sense was heightened, tuned to the feedback from the ground. He felt a slight shift in the texture of the dust under the wood, a subtle change in density. He adjusted his course by a fraction, avoiding the softer patch. His geological mind was a live map, constantly updating. The midpoint of the crossing approached. They were fully committed now, suspended over the waking darkness. There was no turning back. The return journey would be just as perilous if they even made it to the rock. Beneath them, the field felt alive, a patient predator sensing the vibrations of their passage. The light began to soften as the suns dipped lower, shortening their already dwindling time. They were exposed, vulnerable, and utterly dependent on a theory made from wood and cloth. The island stood silent, offering no promise of true safety, only the next stage of the ordeal. They reached the island. The rock was a solid relief under their feet after the tense crossing, but the sight on the other side erased any feeling of safety. The Azuran woman, Nara, was trapped up to her chest in the gray dust. She was not simply stuck. She was integrated into the field's mechanism. Her torso was above the surface, her arms braced against the rock, but from the waist down she was submerged. The deceptive ground did not just hold her, it gripped her. Her legs were ensnared by the same colonial organisms that formed the field's surface. The substance clinging to her had a thick, viscous quality, like a semi-translucent glue. It pulsed with a faint, slow rhythm, a biological process that was actively holding her in place. This was not passive quicksand. It was a predator. The trap was designed to digest weight over time, breaking down anything caught in its grip through a slow enzymatic process. Any struggle, any attempt to pull free only triggered a stronger adhesive response from the organisms, causing her to sink deeper. Jake dropped to his knees at the rock's edge. He tried to get a handhold on her arm, but the act of pulling met with immediate, alarming resistance. The entire surface of the field around her shivered. A low groan echoed from the depths, and the rock beneath his own knees seemed to tremble. Pulling her out by force was not an option. It would trigger a catastrophic collapse of the surrounding membrane, likely swallowing all of them in the process. He had created a stable path to the island, but her body was the new anchor point, the key stressor in the system. He looked at his tools. The rock hammer was useless. Prying against the living glue would be like fighting the ocean with a spoon. The core extractor was designed for mineral samples, not for separating a person from a biological adhesive. His cordage might be used for a pull, but that would guarantee a collapse. His human technology, all of it designed for inanimate matter, was suddenly primitive and inadequate against the living trap. Below them, the field reacted to their concentrated presence. The groaning grew louder. A distinct shift occurred in the vibrations coming up through the rock. It was no longer just the strain of their weight. Something else was moving down there, drawn by the activity. The night hunters were stirring in their dens, sensing the vibrations of the struggle through the ground. The suns were almost gone, the light fading to a deep indigo. Time, which had been short, was now almost gone. The boy, Talok, clung to his mother's arm, his small hands unable to help. Jake's mind raced, discarding one futile plan after another. Direct force was suicide. His tools were worthless. Waiting meant the hunters would arrive. He needed a new variable, a different kind of lever. He needed to use the environment, not fight it. His training had taught him to identify resources. His eyes scanned the darkening landscape, not for a tool to pull, but for a force to exploit. He wasn't looking for a pry bar. He was looking for a key, his gaze fixed on a movement in the distance, a ripple in the purple haze near the field's far edge. An idea dangerous and utterly reckless began to form. The groan from the trembling field shifted in tone. It was no longer just the deep strain of their weight on the membrane. A new vibration joined it, a rapid percussive beating from somewhere below. A section of the gray surface 20 meters away bulged upward. splitting open as a night hunter breached. It was alien and terrible, a creature of gleaming black chitin and multiple articulated limbs, its elongated body surging from the depths. It was drawn to their struggle, a predator sensing the vibrations of trapped prey. Its rigid, segmented back was a flat, dark platform, rising from the liquid hell beneath the dust. Jake's plan was a gamble that used the ecosystem's own rules against itself. The hunter was a threat, but it was also an object. It had mass and structure. Its body provided a temporary point of absolute solidity in the shifting, deceptive plane. He watched its path, calculating its momentum as it surged toward them, drawn by the commotion around Nera. The risk was astronomical. A misjudgment of its speed, a stumble meant being struck by the creature or knocked from the rock into the waiting maw of the field. They would be taken instead. He maneuvered his makeshift float, positioning himself between the rock and the approaching beast. He was a matador using a predator as his cape. He braced his feet against the solid island and held the wood flat on the surface, creating a guide. The hunter's path was direct, a straight line toward the source of the vibrations. As it passed, its hard barnacle-encrusted shell skimmed just beneath the float. For 3 crucial seconds, the creature's back provided a firm, stable bridge directly under the area where Nera was trapped. This was the moment. The stable shell negated the field's grip. The adhesive properties of the colonial organisms were disrupted by the solid moving object passing beneath them. The glue-like hold on Nera's legs weakened. Jake locked eyes with her. He gave a single sharp nod. It was a signal of pure coordination, a silent agreement forged in shared desperation. He grabbed her under the arms. Talak, understanding instantly, added his small strength, pulling on his mother's hands. They heaved together against the stable platform of the hunter's shell. The creature was already moving past, its solidity a fleeting gift. There was a wet, tearing sound as the biological adhesive released its grip. Nera came free with a sudden lurch, the viscous substance snapping like thick strands of rubber. They fell backward onto the safe rock in a tangled heap, just as the night hunter's tail vanished beneath the surface, the field closing seamlessly behind it. The trembling field groaned, the sound returning to its baseline hum. They were on solid ground. Nera gasped, coughing up gray dust, her legs scratched and coated in the alien residue but free. The immediate threat was over, but the purple sky was now a deep, star-studded black. The crossing back across the field awaited them, and the night was now fully alive with the sounds of other hunters. Their reprieve was measured in seconds, their next challenge already beginning. The solid rock of the island was a stark contrast to the shifting death they had just crossed. Jake and the 2 Azurans lay there for a long moment, their breathing heavy in the cold night air. The immediate danger of the trembling field was behind them, but a different kind of distance remained. They were a human and 2 Azurans, members of species with a history of silent conflict and deep-seated fear. The silence between them now was heavy with that unspoken past, a gap that needed to be crossed before they could move. Jake pushed himself up to a sitting position. His water canteen was still clipped to his belt. It was more than half empty now. He unscrewed the cap. The action was simple, but it carried immense weight. On a desert world, water was life. Offering it was a universal signal of aid, a gesture that needed no translation. He held it out to Nera. She was still catching her breath, her blue-tinged skin pale with shock and exhaustion. Her large, dark eyes studied him, then the canteen. The corporation's briefings had described her people as volatile, deceptive. Her gaze held none of that. It held assessment, then a slow, dawning recognition of the risk he had taken. She reached out, her long, thin fingers wrapping around the metal container. Her touch was careful, not taking it from him but accepting the offer. She drank slowly, a small amount, then handed it back. She did not speak his language, but her actions were a clear language of their own. A slight dip of her head, a gesture of acknowledgement. The gratitude was in her eyes, in the way her tense shoulders relaxed a fraction. It was an acceptance of help from a human, a thing that likely defied everything she had been taught. The boy, Talak, moved closer to his mother, his own fear easing as he saw her condition improve. He looked from her face to Jake's, becoming a living bridge between them. He began to speak, his rasping voice translating his mother's soft words. It was not perfect. The words were halting, mixed with gestures. She says, "The deep sand. It holds and does not let go. She is hurt. The translation was more than just words. It conveyed need, intention, and a fragile trust. Jake's mission parameters had officially shifted. The question was no longer if he would help. It was how. He had expended critical resources, exposed himself to unknown dangers, and broken his own strict code. There was no undoing that. The path back to his old life of solitary survival was closed. His focus narrowed to the immediate problems: her injury, the coming night, and the journey to a place of safety. His purpose was redefined not by a corporate directive but by a simple, human choice made on a rock in the dark. He looked at Nara, then at the vast, dark landscape surrounding their small island of safety. The silent agreement between them was not sealed with words or promises. It was forged in the shared vulnerability of the rescue, in the acceptance of water, in the translated plea for further aid. There were three beings against a hostile world, their alliance built on a foundation of necessity and a single quiet act of compassion. The journey ahead would test that bond, but for now it was enough. They had a common goal: survival, together. Nara's legs were a mess of deep scratches and angry purple welts where the field's adhesive had burned her skin. The wounds were severe, weeping a clear fluid. Jake's medkit was a pathetic collection of basics designed for human biology: gauze, antiseptic wipes, painkillers. It was useless here. The tension was immediate. Human medicine was scarce and wrong for Azuran physiology. Her methods were a complete unknown. He had saved her from the trap only to watch her succumb to infection under his care. She shifted, wincing, and her eyes scanned the dark landscape around their rock island, her gaze fixed on a specific cluster of plants growing in a crevice nearby. They were unlike any he'd seen, with broad, silver-flecked fronds that seemed to absorb the starlight. She gestured toward them, her long fingers pointing with clear intent. She spoke to Taluk in her soft, rasping tongue. The boy listened, then turned to Jake. "Sunfern," he said, the word unfamiliar. "She needs it. For the paste." Nara's instructions, relayed through her son, were not a folk remedy or a guess. They were precise and methodical. She indicated which fronds to take, only the ones with a specific dark veining pattern. She mimed the action of crushing them between stones, not grinding them to dust, but into a coarse pulp. She showed him the amount of water to add from the canteen to achieve a thick, consistent paste. This was not primitive guesswork. It was a refined science, a pharmacopoeia developed over generations on this harsh world. Her knowledge was deep and practical, born of necessity and careful observation. Jake's scientific mind recognized the procedure instantly. It was an extraction process. The specific veins likely contained the highest concentration of the active compound. The coarse pulp ensured a slow release, and the precise hydration was critical for the paste to adhere properly and function as a poultice. He followed her directives exactly, crushing the indicated fronds between two flat rocks. The pulp released a sharp, astringent smell. He mixed in the water as instructed, creating a greenish, gritty paste. He held the mixture, looking at Nara. This was the final test of trust. Applying an alien biological agent to open wounds defied every safety protocol he'd ever known. The risk of a toxic reaction or a devastating infection was high, but her expertise was real. He had seen the calculation in her instructions. He applied the poultice to the worst of the wounds on her legs. The effect was immediate and intense. Nara gasped, her body tensing. A fierce burning sensation radiated from the paste, so strong Jake could feel the heat through his fingertips. He held the poultice in place, trusting her completely. The burning peaked and then began to recede, replaced by a deep, cooling numbness. The inflammation around the wounds visibly softened. The painful tension in Nara's face eased, her breathing becoming slower and more regular. The pain was receding, neutralized by the potent extract. It was a definitive result. The first lesson in cross-species science was learned not in a lab, but on a cold rock under alien stars. Human technology had been irrelevant. Her knowledge, specific to this world, had been the only tool that worked. They had survived the night on the island. The immediate threats were dealt with, the wounds treated. But Jake felt no relief. The real danger was just beginning. His own kind were the greater threat. The corporate settlement was a constant expanding presence on this continent, its prefab structures and landing pads spreading like a blight across the red rock. His 3 years of solitude were a deliberate effort to stay off their sensors, to exist in the blank spaces of their maps. His rescue mission had made him a visible anomaly. He knew the corporate protocol by heart. His daily routine was designed around it. Check traps, log findings, avoid detection. His absence from that routine would not go unnoticed. The automated systems would flag his deviation. Director Harkins ran the operation with a cold efficiency. He saw everything in terms of resource allocation and risk assessment. To him, an Azuran life had no value. An employee aiding one was a traitor, a wasted asset compromising the mission. Harkins would see Jake's actions as a direct threat to the bottom line, an act of treason against corporate interests. A tracker would already be on it. Likely Marcos. Jake knew him. A former xenobiologist turned company man, sharp and relentless. He used his knowledge of native biology not for understanding but for control. Marcos would be reviewing the sensor logs, noting the energy signature from Jake's last perimeter check, the path deviation toward the prohibited zone. He would be calculating the vectors, the probabilities. The company's goal was singular: resource extraction. Coexistence was not in the operational manual. Acquiring land meant clearing it by negotiation if cheap, by force if necessary. They had the tools for it. Armored skiffs, seismic survey charges, pulse rifles. Their mandate was to acquire, to take. Jake had just chosen a side in a conflict he had tried so hard to avoid. He had broken the first rule of corporate survival: remain neutral, remain useful, remain invisible. He had made a choice based on something other than profit and loss. The consequences of that choice were now inevitable. They would come for him. They would see his alliance with the Azurans as a security breach to be eliminated. He scanned the horizon, the instinct honed over years of watching for predators. His eyes found the movement first, a dark speck against the pale morning sky. Then the sound reached them, a low, insistent hum that grew steadily louder. It was the sound of a repulsor engine, the kind used on the company's scout skiffs. The vehicle was moving fast, a black arrow heading directly toward the coordinates of his shelter. It was a search pattern, systematic and thorough. The hum solidified into a distinct mechanical drone. The speck resolved into the angular shape of a corporate skiff, its solar panels gleaming. It was not a random patrol. Its course was too direct, its speed too purposeful. It was hunting. The sound confirmed his deepest fears. His deviation had been logged. His position was compromised. The safety of the island was an illusion. The company knew he was out here, and they knew he had broken protocol. The rescue was over. The pursuit had begun. The quiet of the desert was now filled with the sound of his old life coming to collect its due. The hum of the skiff grew louder, a relentless drone hunting them. Nara moved before Jake could speak. She pointed not toward open ground but directly at a wall of towering, wind-sculpted rock that seemed utterly impassable. She led them into the stone, toward a maze of canyons and spires that rose like a natural fortress from the desert floor. To a human eye, it was a navigational nightmare, a chaotic jumble of dead ends and identical passages. To her, it was home. They entered a narrow defile, the high walls casting them into deep shadow. The air grew cool. Jake's eyes, trained to read landscapes, saw the complexity immediately. This was not random erosion. The canyons were too straight in sections, the turns too sharp. It was an engineered defense system, sculpted by nature and perfected by its inhabitants over generations. His geological mind appreciated the brutal sophistication. Wind and water had carved the initial channels, but intelligent hands had widened some, narrowed others, and created choke points perfect for an ambush. Nara did not hesitate at intersections. Her fingers would brush against the rock face, tracing patterns Jake could barely see. The carved markers were there, subtle depressions and lines that told stories and gave directions only her people could read. They were a living map written in stone. She led them to a section of wall that looked solid, identical to the rest. She pressed her palm against a specific sequence of these marks. With a low grind of stone on stone, a section pivoted inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. This was a secret route, one of many woven through the seemingly solid rock. The passage was lined with a faintly glowing bioluminescent fungus, providing just enough light to see. It was not a primitive hideaway. It was a calculated feature of the maze's design, a way to bypass danger and outmaneuver any pursuer. Nara was its librarian, her knowledge the key that unlocked the fortress. Inside, the sounds of the searching skiff were muffled, then gone, Replaced by the echo of their own breathing and the scuff of their boots on stone, they emerged onto a high ledge overlooking a labyrinth of canyons. Below, the corporate skiff had reached the maze's outer edge. It hovered there, unable to enter the narrow passages. Men disembarked, armed with rifles, and began to proceed on foot. From this vantage, Jake could see their confusion. Their tech was useless here. Their sensors would be blinded by the mineral-rich rock. They were entering a territory that defied their maps and their logic. Jake watched the armed men slowly, cautiously, begin to pick their way into the first canyon. He saw the tactical advantage laid out before him like a diagram. The maze's nature was its greatest weapon. The company relied on technology, communication, and visual markers. The maze defeated all of it. He turned to Nara. His plan was not to fight them directly. It was to use the maze against them. He proposed using the narrowest passages to split their forces, to lead them into dead ends, and to use the knowledge of the secret routes to appear and disappear at will. They would not confront the company's strength. They would dissolve it in a sea of stone. The ground shakers were not monsters. They were a planetary force as natural and inevitable as the twin suns. Their segmented bodies moved deep beneath the stone, generating massive electromagnetic pulses with each tectonic shift of their immense forms. This EMP was a biological weapon on a grand scale, a burst of energy that could scramble any advanced technology, frying circuits and draining power cells in an instant. It was a defense mechanism, not an attack, but its effect on the company's gear would be the same. Jake's plan was a simple, brutal inversion. The company's greatest advantage was their tech. His strategy turned that advantage into their primary liability. He would be the bait. The corporate forces wanted him for treason. They would chase him without question. He would lure them, drawing their skiffs and armed personnel into a specific canyon network, a natural channel that acted as a migration path for the Shakers. Their desire to capture him would blind them to the terrain's purpose. Nara's role was guidance. Her people's knowledge was the key. She knew the Shakers' patterns, the deep vibrations that signaled their approach, the specific routes they traveled under the maze. She could read the stone like a map, predicting where and when the EMP would strike. Her task was to position Jake, to ensure he was the lure that brought the hunters into the kill zone at the exact right moment. Their cooperation was a fusion of human desperation and Azuran wisdom. The company's vehicles were sleek and fast, their rifles capable of stunning a target at 500 meters. None of that mattered against the pulse. The EMP would not discriminate. It would hit everything within its radius. Their skiffs would drop from the sky like stones, their repulsors dead. Their comms would go silent. Their powered armor would become heavy, inert shells. Their rifles would be useless metal and plastic. In seconds, their technological superiority would evaporate, leaving them disoriented, isolated, and vulnerable on foot in a hostile maze. The risk was extreme. The ground shakers did not care about sides. The pulse would disable Jake's own gear if he was too close. His survival would depend on timing and Nara's precise directions. One miscalculation, and he would be trapped on foot with a dozen armed and angry company soldiers, his only advantage gone. The plan also risked the Shakers themselves. Driving a massive creature toward armed men could provoke a violent reaction, a fight that could devastate the maze and its inhabitants. It was a gamble with the highest stakes, betting their lives on the predictable behavior of an unpredictable natural phenomenon. The tension lay in the execution. Every element had to align. Jake's run through the canyons had to be visible enough to pull the entire company force, yet fast enough to stay ahead of them. Nara's signals from the high rocks had to be perfectly timed. They had to trust each other completely. A human and an Azuran operating in silent sync under pressure. The company's overconfidence was their weakness. They would see a lone man running and give chase, never suspecting the trap was not made of walls, but of energy. The plan was set. There would be no grand battle, no exchange of fire. This was a trap built on biology, not ballistics. It weaponized the planet's own rhythm against the invaders. Jake checked the charge on his own equipment, knowing it would be worthless soon. He looked at Nara. Her nod was slow, certain. She pointed toward the eastern canyon, the agreed-upon path. The low, grinding hum of the approaching corporate skiffs was growing louder. It was time to move. The Shakers were coming. The trap was ready. The amplified voice echoed through the canyon, a layer of artificial calm over the natural rock. Marco stood on a high outcrop, his figure silhouetted against the pale sky. He held a comm unit, his words projected to carry. The offer he made was a careful construction, a demand for surrender wrapped in the language of a peaceful resolution. He promised safety. He promised a designated area for them to live, away from the company's operations. The words were smooth, reasonable, designed to sound like diplomacy to a human ear. The tension was in the space between his words and his meaning. The peaceful resolution meant Azuran displacement. It meant leaving the canyons, the stone maze, the trembling fields. To accept was to abandon their home, their history, and their entire purpose on this world. The offer was not a negotiation. It was a proposal for cultural death, presented with a polite face. The company got the land and its resources. The Azurans got a cage with a view. The elder listened, her face a mask of weathered stone. Her large dark eyes did not blink. She understood the true cost of the words. The designated area was a reservation, a small patch of land to die on slowly, cut off from the sacred places and the food sources. It was the end of their way of life, sold to them as a fair deal. Marco spoke of avoiding conflict, but his presence and the armed men positioned behind him were the unspoken threat. It was the stick offered after the carrot. Jake watched from the shadows, his jaw tight. He saw the calculation behind the offer, the cold corporate greed. This was not about coexistence. It was about efficient acquisition. Removing the Azurans cleanly was cheaper and faster than a protracted fight. The offer was a business transaction, a way to clear an obstacle with minimal expense. Marcos used his knowledge of their culture to make the poison pill easier to swallow. He knew what they valued, and he offered to take it all away gently. The canyon fell silent. The hum of the skiffs was the only sound. All eyes were on the elder. She took a slow step forward, her movement deliberate. She did not look at the armed men or the hovering vehicles. She looked at the rock under her feet, at the high walls of her home. Her voice, when it came, was not amplified. It was quiet, but it carried through the still air with the weight of absolute truth. There were no grand speeches, no negotiations. Her refusal was simple, final, and rooted in a reality Marcos could never comprehend. "This is our home," she said. The words hung there, a boundary line drawn in stone. The illusion of diplomacy was shattered. The real conflict could now begin. Jake's old life was gone. The act of giving water to a child had burned it all away. His solitary outpost, his carefully secured shelter with its stockpile of rations and mapped perimeters, was now enemy territory. The company knew. His daily signal to the orbital monitor had gone unsent. His absence from the grid was a red flag. He could never go back. That door was shut and locked from the outside. His identity as a neutral geologist was erased. For 3 years, that title had been his shield. It gave him purpose, a reason to be alone, a way to justify the isolation. He was the observer, the note-taker, the man who studied rocks, not people. That neutrality was a lie now. He had chosen a side. The corporate ID tag in his pocket was worthless metal. The man on that card no longer existed. He had lost everything he had built. The shelter was a loss of safety. The routine was a loss of control. His official purpose was a loss of direction. Every trap he'd set, every water source he'd charted, every danger he'd logged, it was all for a version of himself that was finished. The meticulous life of survival for its own sake was over. The things he had clung to were gone. He had gained a cause he never wanted. He had a people he did not understand. He was in a war he did not choose. The price of that single moment of compassion was the total safety of his isolation. The silence he had cherished was now filled with the sounds of others, their needs, their language, their fight. The weight was different. It was no longer just the weight of his own survival. He was a fugitive from his own species. The company would mark him as a traitor, a rogue asset to be terminated. His alliance with the Azurans made him an enemy of humanity's expansion on this world. There was no reversing this. The path back was cut off. This was the absolute point of no return in his journey. The choices ahead were not about if he would fight, but how. He looked at the Azurans around him. Nara, her leg bandaged with the poultice she had taught him to make. Talok, who had trusted a stranger with his mother's life. The elder, who had refused a polite offer of extinction. They were not a project to study. They were not a resource to extract. They were people. They had history, knowledge, and a right to exist. His purpose shifted. It was no longer in the rocks under his feet. the mineral seams and soil samples. His purpose was in the people standing beside him. It was a purpose worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. The geologist was gone. In his place was a man who had finally found something more valuable than his own survival. He had found a reason to stop running and start defending. The fight for their home had become his fight.